Let's spend some time talking about user experience roles and responsibilities. You'll often hear me talk, and you'll hear about it in the literature and stuff if you read too much about UX in the real world, so to speak. You'll hear talking about the elusive UX unicorn. And if you listen to one of the earlier lectures, I referred to the fact that for the longest time, the outside world, outside of this field, tended to kind of lump UX, human computer interaction, UCD, usability. They picked whatever term they were most comfortable with, and they kind of lumped everybody together. And you would legitimately get job descriptions that basically said, we need somebody who can do research, can do design, both interaction design and visual design, and they should be able to code and prototype and all of that. And if you work in this field for very long, you quickly realize that that person, I can't say doesn't exist, because, certainly there are those gifted people who can do all of these things equally well. But I'd say 99% of us are not equally gifted in all elements of these things. The longer you spend in the field, the better you get at various things. But all of us are particularly deep in a few parts of the UX skill set, and have, what you really need is a working knowledge, to be able to speak to the full gamut, and then be particularly deep in one or a couple of things. And so, luckily, one of the things we've seen as the discipline matures and how the outside world views the discipline matures is we're at least starting to see some separation in job descriptions between user experience researchers, user experience designers, and user experience programmers or UI programmers, or basically people who are doing the actual coding of the user interface, who are that point that are, they are the technical folks who are implementing the user interface, but but they are still people who have a little toehold in this world because, their specialization, instead of specializing in network programming or servers or whatever else, their specialization is, optimization of the UI and that sort of thing. So let's dig a little deeper, though, into the various roles. So let's meet the user interface team, the UX team. This diagram, I believe, comes out of the UX book textbook. These are some different places. So this wheel, the design, prototype, evaluate, and analyze, that's the wheel that the UX book is going to use. I'm actually going to expand that process slightly. As you'll hear me talk about when I talk about the UX process. Generally, the UX process, it's got either 4 or 5 elements, but the general elements of the process: design, prototype, evaluate, analyze, design, prototype, evaluate. Sorry, they're generally the same. You're doing some research and analysis. You're doing some design. You're doing some prototype. You're doing evaluation. So you've got a user researcher, you've got an interaction designer who works with a visual designer, you've got somebody doing prototyping, and so you're prototyping, depending on what kind of prototypes you're doing and what software you're using to do those prototypes. It could be your interaction designer doing prototypes. It could be, if you're doing code prototypes, it could be a technical person doing the prototypes. As a researcher who has technical skills, I tend to do my own prototypes. If you're doing pencil and paper prototypes, who knows who's doing your prototypes? And then you've got a usability analyst, who sometimes is the same person as your user researcher, sometimes not. We'll get into that just a little bit more. You may be interfacing with a technical writer. You may have a subject matter expert you're interfacing with as a researcher. And then you've got the UX manager who kind of directs everything and gets the team going in the same direction. So next, though, we want to deep dive a little bit more into each of those roles. So first, you've got the UX researcher. Some of their key tasks are interviews, observations, participatory design. They're looking at the trends. They're potentially generating personas, vision and strategy, journey maps. They're working at that analyze stage. I tend to split, and this is where I talked about 4 versus 5 parts to the user experience process. I've always come from the school of thought that there's 5 steps to the process, and instead of just saying analyze, like that UX book textbook says, I say research and synthesis, because I feel too many people forget how long synthesis does, and I really want to put that emphasis, and a lot of folks really like to put that emphasis on the synthesis as a separate activity from just research. And I'll discuss more about that separation during a process discussion. Regardless, the UX researcher is really looking, is really the lead during both that research and synthesis exercise. The UX researcher is not working in a vacuum, however. They are talking to users. They are talking to subject matter experts. They're obviously interfacing with the UX manager and the business analysts, business managers to get some direction. But they're also, if the team is well oiled, the UX researcher is partnering with the interaction designer, with the visual designer, with the programmers to say, hey, what kind of information do you need in order to be effective? And then they are taking that information and rolling it into their research plan so that they're getting the information that the people downstream in the UX process can be to be effective. Because when the interaction designer is taking over to the point that they're lead in the process, if they don't have the information they need in order to start doing their job, then the UX researcher hasn't really done a complete job. Now, that being said, hopefully part of what the UX researcher may be doing is some upfront research to determine what is it the user even wants. And there's a whole cycle back and forth with the product management team to help define what is it that we're even trying to build. What is it that the users want? Where is the product opportunity? Where is the service opportunity if we're looking at service design? But once something's been decided, or, and occasionally the right answer is that there's nothing here to build, but the user researcher in an ideal world is working with that product team to determine what are the opportunities. And once that decision is made, then the user researcher looks inward and says, okay, this is what we've been tasked with. We know that the users have said yes, that these are the opportunities, or we should say, we know that our user research shows that these are the opportunities that are available. And then, working with the interaction designers to say, what is the kind of information that I need to gather you up front before you even start designing. And then from there, the interaction designers can make some initial swags, and then it's a partnership to figure out what's the right cycle of prototype research. Next, we get to the interaction designer, and this is where we're rolling into that design phase. And one thing I will stress throughout the entire semester is that even though sometimes you'll see me illustrate the process as a straight line, this is never a straight line, this is a cycle. And it's not even a straight line cycle. That slide you saw a couple slides ago showed it as a cycle with no iteration in between. Honestly, at any point you can go back to an earlier point in the cycle. So you may get to the design phase and realize you don't have all the answers and go back to research and vice versa. And so really the design should be very iterative. And so the interaction designer will do some task analysis, they'll define some use cases and do some storyboarding, and then they'll potentially draw some prototypes, and then they'll go back and work with the researcher to figure out what's the right way to test those things. And then they'll do some iteration on the prototypes to determine, okay, this didn't quite work, so let's iterate the prototypes, go back, do some initial user testing, additional user testing, and just do some iteration like that. So, and then of course, there's some interaction with the visual designer as well to determine how that interaction design is going to look once it's got its visual design as well, because in a perfect world, the visual design is not simply lipstick on a pig. It is working hand in hand with the interaction design to make to send a cohesive message that colors and all of that and icons and everything have meaning. And let's go ahead and move forward to the visual designer. So, the colors have meaning, the graphics, the iconography, that sort of thing. A lot of times visual designers will have brand standards and that sort of thing that they do have to adhere to, which is fine. But part of their job is to figure out, are there places where the brand standards may inhibit user comprehension and the utility of the product, and in which case, they need to stand up and help advocate for the user. Next, we've got the UI developer that I alluded to a little bit. They could be creating interactive prototypes if that's the point that they need to be at, but they also will be working with designers to translate design into code if we have that person on the roll. And I have worked in a couple of different places now that have dedicated UI developers that their job is, they are that person that straddles the team. And I've been lucky enough to be in organizations where that UI developer was dedicated to the user experience team, and they were working side by side with our visual designers, with our interaction designers, to build out the code as we were giving it to them. And then they did service the interface with the development teams that were picking up the code. But it was really nice to be able to have that partnership with the developers who are building the UI and not just throwing it over the wall like so often happens with code, with handing off a designed user interface into development teams. Next, we have the usability researcher. Sometimes, especially on smaller teams, your user researcher and your usability researcher will be the same person. Other times I've worked in, when I was still at GE, I had two very distinct, I had a user researcher who was very uncomfortable with usability research and vice versa. Usability research, by its nature, tends to be quite a bit more structured, especially if you're in an organization like I've alluded to at GE, where we had we were trying to get test results that would allow us to make regulatory filings, that we had to prove the safety and efficacy of our products. And so we had very structured tests that we had to have, time on task, error percentages, and that sort of things. And so we had to have tests that were, while, an academic would look at the tests and say, okay, well, I'm not even sure that's entirely statistically significant, but we did have to meet a certain confidence interval on our results and the repeatability of our results and that sort of thing. And it's just a slightly different skill set. Just like coding and testing are, while they both deal with code, it's two slightly different sides. I mean, it's two sides of the same, not even quite two sides of the same coin. It's dealing with similar data in different ways. It's the same sort of thing. I mean, you're interacting with users in both cases, but the types of data you collect and the way you interface with that data can be very, very different. In one case you're potentially dealing with a lot more qualitative data, and one you're dealing with a lot more quantitative data. But once again, small teams, oftentimes the same person will need to deal with both. Like on larger teams, I had the luxury of being able to dedicate one person to leading most of our upfront user research efforts, and one person who really focused on the usability testing. Personally, I've been around long enough. I'm pretty comfortable working both ways, but that's somewhat a factor of the fact. I mean, is due to the fact that I've been in the industry for a very long time, and I've had the ability to do that. I mean, honestly, one of the things that I was working on with both of my folks as a career growth, was getting them comfortable in playing in the other person's sandbox, so to speak. There's a couple of different approaches. You've got the interaction designer and you've got a UI software designer. If you describe the interaction from the user's view, it should result in a more usable design than trying to describe it from the software or programmer view, basically saying this is how the user should use the product, or is using the product, as opposed to saying this is how the software works. And I will say, it is an inherent conflict of interest. What is best for the user is seldom easiest for the software developer. And I can't tell you how many times over the years I've gone to a new team and I've said, I want the software to do this because this is what's going to be easiest for the user. And inevitably, a software developer looks at me and goes, oh, she's not going to know what she's talking about, because they take one look at me and decide, oh, she's a girl, she doesn't know how to program. And so they say, oh, no, can't be done. Users are just going to have to figure something else out. So I go home and I code what I want and I bring it back and I say, this is what I want it to do. And that's usually the last argument I get from that particular team. Once they figure out I actually do know how to code, they stop arguing with me on the basis of what's easiest. And then I have to do it with the next team I work with. Now, luckily, that does actually happen with every single team. And I'm not saying that software engineers should blindly adhere to whatever the interaction designers, the UX folks say, because let's face it, the UX folks are often wrong, are not often wrong, are sometimes wrong as well. What I would like to point out, though, is the best teams, and when I say teams, I mean software teams as a whole, UX plus software engineering, are ones who are at least somewhat versed in the other's world so that they can have a conversation. The UX folks should be walking in as the user advocate. The software engineering team should be coming in and having a conversation as the technology advocate. And frankly, you really should have the business folks in the room coming in as the business advocate, because really the right solution is somewhere in the middle, because we are trying to sell a product and make money. The right solution is somewhere in the middle as far as what makes the most sense from a technology standpoint, user standpoint, and what's going to be the best for the business as far as a sales/costs perspective. Now, depending on what exactly it is we're talking about at any given time, it may, that particular solution may slide a little bit towards the user, towards technology, towards business, because honestly, what's best for the user, if it's something that only gets used once a year, I may, as a user experience person, actually may say, you know what? It only gets used once a year. I'm okay with letting it go and making it easier for technology to code in this particular case. But that's a conversation I can have in context. Whereas if it's something that users are using multiple times a day, I'm going to stand my ground and argue that it's worth the extra time investment on the side of the software engineers, because it's going to save us time down the road in lost sales and customer complaints, in fielding customer complaint calls and that sort of thing. And so it's really not an all or nothing conversation, and it really should be done. And that's why, for those of you in computer science who are going into software engineering, I don't expect you to come out of this class and say, oh, I'm going to be a UX person. Those of you who are going into software engineering, I want you to come out of this class with an appreciation for why this is important, even if you don't go into this field. I do think knowing why this stuff is important does make you a better software developer down the road. All right, I'm off my soapbox. Let's move on just a little bit. So I was hinting a little bit ago about the whole idea of the not, we aren't unicorns. So there's a bunch of different conversations about in the literature about is it better to be a UX generalist, a UX specialist? Where should we be? And all of that. And honestly, I read all of it, but this is what has stuck with me. Peter Bursma, who is a prominent information architect at the time, came up with this idea of the T model of user experience several years ago. And I've read several different arguments since then, and honestly, this is the one that still makes sense to me. It makes sense to me as both a practitioner, and it makes sense to me as a hiring manager as well. So this is the T model of user experience. Now, there's also been some arguments that I do agree with, that what the legs of this model should be have certainly evolved over the years. If you remember back to, in one of the other lectures, all of those little bubbles of what constitutes user experience, any of those bubbles could be one of these legs. But I just took some of the basic ones that we've talked about in this section and put them as legs for now. So if you think about the T model of user experience, the T model of user experience says that there are any number of things in the world of user experience. If you are going to be a good user experience person, you should be conversant in a good number of the things. Now, as user experience continues to expand, you're not going to be conversant in everything. Used to, when I started, we didn't have all this stuff with the service design. We didn't have all this stuff with architecture. We didn't have all of these other newer elements. We were really still just focused on software and user interfaces, and heck, even mobile wasn't the big deal that it is, because back then my flip phone was still a brick. So we weren't even looking at mobile interfaces. So when I started, this right here, actually, hell, ignoring content strategy, this right here really was the T model when I started. So if we look at this, if I wanted to be a successful user experience person, I really needed to be able to speak to anything in this T. I should be able to have a conversation with somebody about these things. But I'm not going to be equally good in all of these. I need to be able to pick a few of these that I'm going to become good in, that's going to be my specialty. That's going to be what I'm known for. But I need to be able to speak to any of these things. These days, given how user experience has expanded, you kind of got to decide. It's more like it's a T model of one part of user experience. So if you're going to specialize in service design, or if you're going to specialize in the Internet of Things, you need to, your legs may be slightly different. You need to be conversant in the aspects of the Internet of Things, even though you're not equally good in all of the things that touch the Internet of Things, or something like that. But let me get to the second slide in this so it makes a little more sense. So, for example, this is what I look like. My particular T model looks like. I was saying how, if this is what just, across the board, this is the things that I want to be, because let's face it, I'm still mainly a software user interface person. I have plenty of experience across other parts of UX, but I'm still mainly a software user interface person. That's my focus these days. So this is where I am. Like I've mentioned before, I'm not a visual designer. I cannot execute very well on visual design. I can teach you the concepts. I can certainly critique it. I can test it, and I can tell you when something's wrong with it, but I can't execute on it. But I'm really strong in user research. I'm really strong in usability engineering. Usability engineering was kind of what my whole graduate degree. Technology and computer science, I'm not quite as strong as I am in the research pieces of that, because, well, frankly, all the coding I do these days is for fun. I do a lot of macro coding because I don't do my statistics in SPSS or SAS or anything like that. I do them in Excel with a lot of macros to shortcut stuff. So and I do a lot of like HTML and Node.js and stuff like that. So my coding is for fun, which is the reason why I'm not quite as strong there. I'm also a pretty good interaction designer, but once again, I'm not a designer. I'm more of a researcher and a technologist, which is why here. Now, I talk about as a hiring manager, the way this works, because I did manage a team for a long time at GE. The way I, as a hiring manager, want to make this work is this is what I want my team to look like. So what I do is I hire a bunch of people that may look like this, but I hire them so that each of their legs offsets somebody else on the team's leg, so that when I stack everybody together, what I get is something close to this. And so you as a user experience person, and I will probably go over this whole thing again when we get to the portfolio section in the class. What you want to do as a user experience person in your own right is decide what's most interesting to you, and you want to work on those particular strengths. I happen to enjoy research. Work on those strengths, but make sure that you also keep reading, keep teaching yourself the other things, so that you can have conversations and you can understand what's going on. And I think it's really key that regardless of what you do, I think it's really key that you stay up on the technology side of things. I don't expect everybody to learn how to code. That's just a happy accident because I started out as a computer science major before I knew that this field even existed. But I do think being able to talk technology with the technologists and sound like you know what you're talking about, and frankly know what you're talking about, does make life a lot easier, because you are able to have a better conversation with folks about those trade-offs and things like that. So to sum up, that's kind of where UX roles and responsibilities fit in the big picture.